Hi, I'm Lana Bennett with Singer Sewing Company. Today I'd like to share some ideas and techniques for quilting with you. When I first started to quilt, I was a little intimidated with the idea of creating a full-size quilt for a bed. So I started with small items such as pot holders and wall hangings. I'll show you how to create an applique with a satin stitch, an applique with a blind hem stitch, some crazy quilt stitches, also how to bind your quilt and do some decorative top stitching. Quilting can be so much fun and so creative. You'll love creating beautiful projects for friends, family, and your home. Let's get started. The tools you need for quilting are just as important as the fabric and the design that you choose. Start with a cutting mat. Notice on the cutting mat you have grids and lines and curves. These are perfect for cutting your fabric and having different shapes and straight edges. The rotary cutter will give you very sharp, crisp cuts when you're cutting your pieces. Make sure the ruler that you choose goes along with your rotary cutter. Templates are wonderful for marking designs on fabric. You also will need scissors, a marking pencil, pins, and safety pins are nice to have for basting your quilt together with pins instead of with thread. You'll also choose your fabric, batting, and thread. Sometimes choosing the fabric is the hardest part of the design. Colors and designs can be very difficult to choose. The fabric stores these days have a wide selection of fabrics that coordinate. There's some beautiful kits and templates that are available also. So visit your local fabric store and your imagination, and you'll have a beautiful quilt. To help you choose the style and colors of fabrics and patterns, think about where the quilt will be used. Will it be a baby's quilt? Will it be used in the living room? Maybe a throw across the bed? That will help you decide on the color and style of the quilt you want to make. You'll also need to think how the quilt will be laundered or cared for. Will it be washed or will it be dry cleaned? If it is going to be washed, be sure to pre-shrink your fabric. This will prevent any fading or shrinkage before you put the quilt together. You also need to determine how much fabric you'll use. You can look on the back of the pattern if you're purchasing a pattern or do the calculations as far as the size that the quilt will be. You'll also need to purchase batting. What I have here today is a low loft batting, which means it's a thin batting. There's also high loft batting, which is thick and fluffy. That will give you a very different effect on your quilt, so you'll need to decide that also. Let's move on and start our quilt. The center of our quilt will have 8 squares across and 6 rows down. The first step in constructing the center of our quilt is cutting 2 4-inch wide strips of fabric and sewing them together. Next, carefully cut the long strips into 4-inch sections. Pair the 2 block sections together to make a 4-block row. Next, sew 2 of the 4-block rows together to create an 8-block row. Finally, sew 6 8-block rows together to create the finished center piece. Let's watch as each step is explained. We're going to start by constructing the inside. I made my blocks 4-inch squares, so I cut 4-inch strips of the print fabric. You'll take the strips and place them right sides together and pin in place. I'm now ready to move over to the sewing machine and use a 1/4-inch seam to stitch them together. We're now going to stitch our 2 pieces of fabric together. Place your fabric under the presser foot, lower your needle, and straight stitch 1/4 inch. Going to back tack several stitches and then continue sewing. When you reach the end, back tack again. You'll now want to go to your ironing board and press the seam allowances towards the dark side of the fabric. Now we have our two strips sewn together and the seam allowance pressed to one side. This is where the mat comes in handy again with the grid. Line up your fabric strips and cut the raw edges. Now you'll need to cut each square 4 inches. From our strip of fabric, we've created now 2 4-inch squares. Continue moving on down the strip, cutting 4-inch squares. For the particular quilt I'm constructing today, I'm going to have 8 squares across and 6 rows down. We've now taken our single squares and turned them into 2 square pieces. Now we'll need to put them together and create 4 square pieces. I like to take my pieces and lay them together in pairs, making sure I have alternating colors. I have my dark with my light. I take each grouping and put them in pairs before I go to my sewing machine. Next, we'll want to pin our pieces in place. And now we're ready to go off to the sewing machine again. We're now going to stitch these pieces together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and a straight stitch. Lower your needle into the fabric, back tack, and continue sewing. We now have 4 blocks sewn together. Continue sewing the blocks together. Our quilt is slowly but surely coming together. I'm now going to take my 4 square pieces and place them together, making sure I have alternating dark and light fabrics. We'll pin these pieces together and once again use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to stitch them in place. Let's stitch our 4 squares together. Pin the pieces together, place them under the sewing machine, lower the needle, back tack, and straight stitch down the seam. Back tack at the end and remove from the machine. You're now ready to go to your ironing board again and press the seam allowance to the dark side of the fabric. We're now ready to take our 8 block rows and stitch them together. Once again, make sure you alternate dark and light colors when you pin them together. When pinning the strips together, it's a good idea to place a pin in each of the seam allowances. This will give you perfectly matched blocks. We're now ready to go to the sewing machine again. We now have our 8 block rows, and we're going to sew together 2 rows. Place your fabric under the presser foot, lower your needle, and stitch a 1/4 inch seam. Back tack and continue sewing. Remember, we had carefully pinned at each corner to have perfectly matched blocks. back tack at the end again and remove the fabric. Once again, we need to go to the ironing board and press the seam allowance to one side. Continue sewing all the rows together. We now have the center of our quilt constructed. We've taken our blocks and sewn 2 blocks together, then 4, and then 8. To minimize the margin of error, we've created our blocks in rows and then constructed the rows together. Now we're ready to cut our side border pieces. Measure from the top of the fabric to the bottom. I like to cut my side pieces first. Align your fabric on the grid of the mat. Then take your quilting ruler, place it on the fabric, and cut. When you get to the end, place it on the lengthwise and cut your strip. When you're cutting your top and bottom strips, be sure to add the side border measurements into the top and bottom strip measurements. Once the strips are cut, lay right sides together on the side and pin in place. We're back to the sewing machine to stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now that we've attached our border pieces, we're ready to sew those onto our quilt blocks. Be sure to sew the side pieces first before the top and bottom. Lower your presser foot and your needle, backstitch, and sew using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's important to sew the side pieces first before the top and bottom so that you can add the measurement of the side borders to the top and bottom pieces. Backstitch at the end and remove from the machine. Go back to the ironing board again and press the seam allowance out towards the border. Then stitch your second border. Now you're ready to measure for the top and bottom and sew those on also. We have all the pieces sewn together now except for the top piece, so we'll sew our last border piece on. Backstitch at the end of the seam and take the fabric out. Once again, you'll want to go to your ironing board and press the seam allowance out towards the border. We've now attached our side borders and our top borders to the center of the quilt squares. Our next step is to cut our batting and backing slightly larger than the front of the quilt. The reason we do this is when we quilt, sometimes the batting and backing pull in slightly. You can either hand baste or use large safety pins to hold the quilt pieces together. The next step is how you want to stitch the top of your quilt. On my quilt, I've done straight rows of stitching. This is called channel quilting. You can do decorative stitching on your quilt also if you choose. To mark my rows, I took my quilting ruler and laid it along the green squares and then drew lines with my fabric marker. You'd then go to your sewing machine and stitch along the lines that you marked. We've chosen to machine stitch our quilt pieces together, but there are other methods also. One method is to hand tie the quilt. This quilt was done with yarn and just strategically placed. You get a very different effect by hand tying or machine stitching. Let's go back to the machine. Now that I have the top of the quilt, the batting, and the backing together and pinned, I'm ready to do some stitching to quilt the pieces together. First of all, I'm going to begin stitching along the edge of the binding and the center of the quilt, right in the seam area. I'm going to lower my needle, lower my presser foot, take 1 or 2 stitches and just back tack 1 or 2 stitches. Then continue right down the center of that seam. This is called stitching in the ditch. And you want to try and get as close to the center of that seam as possible because the stitches actually can become invisible if you're right in the center of that stitch. We're going to continue around stitching down and around the whole border. We've now sewn the whole way around the border. When we get to the end, stop right at the corner and just backstitch 1 or 2 stitches. The reason we're only doing 1 or 2 stitches is you don't want to see a lot of back tacking at that edge. Remove the fabric from the machine and trim your threads. Now we're ready to do some stitching in the center of the quilt blocks. We marked at the table lines coming diagonally across the blocks. So I'm going to now straight stitch down through these lines. Line up the presser foot with the line, and once again, just take 1 or 2 back stitches. Then continue following the line down through the block. When we reach the end, again, just 1 or 2 back stitches. We're now ready to stitch the second row. Back stitch 1 or 2 stitches and continue. Make sure the quilt stays nice and flat. This will prevent any puckering. As you continue sewing and getting farther into the center of the quilt, you may want to start to roll the fabric in the inside of the sewing arm here. Back tack 1 or 2 stitches and remove from the machine. Continue to sew the rest of the straight lines through your quilt blocks. Now that we've done the stitching on the quilt, we're ready to even out the edges with the batting, the backing, and the top. Lay your ruler along the edge and take your rotary cutter and even out the edges. This will give you square edges and trim away any loose threads. We're now ready to attach the binding. Most quilts have a binding along the edge. What I'm going to do now is show you how to create that binding. As we talked about before, the mat has a grid and lines on it. I've cut a square of fabric and lined it up on the grid, and I'm going to use the diagonal line that goes across the center. Align your quilting ruler, hold down firmly, and cut with your rotary cutter. If you need to reposition, gently pick up your quilting ruler and reposition. To create the binding strips, decide how wide you would like the binding on the edge of your quilt. You'll need about 1/4 of an inch on each side to turn under, so please add that in. Once again, take your rotary cutter mat and place along the side of the fabric with the width of the binding. Hold it down firmly and cut again. What we've created is a strip that's on the bias of the fabric. The bias is on the diagonal cut of the grain instead of on the straight cut. This gives you more give to the fabric. That way, if you have any curves or angles, it will lay nice and flat. Now what you need to do is take the strips and piece them together. These strips that I just demonstrated are bias strips, and they work very nicely on curved areas. The strips that I made for the quilt are on the straight grain because our quilt has very straight edges. I cut these 1½ inches wide and the length and width of the quilt the whole way around. To begin your binding, turn under approximately 1/4 inch before you pin down and begin sewing. You want to make sure that you pin through all 3 layers of the fabric and the binding included. So you're actually pinning 4 layers together. After you have your binding pinned in place, position it under the needle and presser foot, lower your needle, and backstitch 1 or 2 stitches. Continue sewing 1/4 inch around the binding edge. As you come to the end, make sure you overlap the binding approximately 1 inch. Back tack and remove from your machine. Trim the binding now close to where you ended your stitching. Once again, you're going to want to return to your ironing board and press the seam allowance of the binding to the outside towards the binding. You'll then want to press under 1/4 inch and then press the binding to the back of the quilt. This is what creates your bound edge. Pin this in place and then we'll be ready to stitch again. After pressing your binding, you want to pin in place. Once again, we're going to stitch in the ditch. Place the fabric under the presser foot and lower your needle right into the seam. Again, you'll just take 1 or 2 stitches and 1 and 2 stitches to back tack. Continue sewing, being very careful to stitch in the ditch. What you're doing when you're stitching is catching the binding in the back as well as stitching in the ditch on the front. When you get to the corner, carefully lower the needle into the corner, raise the presser foot, and pivot. Continue sewing down the other side. We now have the binding sewn on all 4 sides. We almost have our quilt completed. At this point, you may want to take the template and add a decorative stitch along the border. Position the template, use your chalk pencil, and draw your lines. I'm just going to use the center line in this template. Reposition your template until you've reached the end of the border. Place your quilt back under the sewing machine and stitch along the white chalk line. You need to sew slowly to turn the corners and curves to follow the line. Be sure to stop and reposition your quilt so you don't have any bunching and gathering while you're stitching. You want to use your damp cloth again to take out the chalk marks. Believe it or not, we finished our quilt. It wasn't that difficult, was it? A quilt sleeve is a great way to display your newly created masterpiece. Once the sleeve is attached to the back of your quilt, simply insert a section of lattice into the sleeve and your quilt is ready to be hung anywhere. Let's see how the sleeve is constructed. To create a sleeve for your quilt, cut a piece of fabric 10 inches wide and the width of your quilt. Add 1/2 inch on each end for a seam allowance. Press under the seam allowance on each end. Take the piece and place it with right sides together lengthwise. Set your sewing machine for a straight stitch and stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Lower your needle, take several stitches, back tack, and continue to sew. When you reach the end, back tack once again, then remove the fabric from the machine. Go back to your ironing board and press the seam allowance to one side. Then turn right sides out. Position the sleeve at the top edge of your quilt. Pin in place at the top and bottom. Hand stitch in place also through the back and the batting, but be sure not to go through to the front. When it's hand stitched in place, you're ready to insert a wooden lattice and hang the quilt on the wall. I'd like to now show you some applique techniques. Applique can add a very interesting effect to the quilts that you're constructing. Notice on this quilt, we have applique with straight stitching along the outside. This is the same piece with just the applique and no straight stitching. Look at the different effects that you can create. We're going to construct some pot holders. The first pot holder will have applique with satin stitching, and the second one applique with a blind hem stitch. I've cut my fabric to the size of the pot holder that I'd like, and then I've cut my applique pieces. I have webbing fused to the back of the applique piece. This makes it easy when you're trying to stitch around each piece. Let's move over to the machine and do some satin stitching and some blind hem stitching around our applique pieces. The first type of applique I'm going to show you is the blind hem stitch applique. Most of the time you'll use a transparent thread with this technique. That way it will actually be a blind stitch and you'll just see the applique piece. You'll need to lower your presser foot and lower your needle just into the edge of the fabric between the applique and the base fabric. You're going to start by taking several stitches. You want the straight stitch to run right along the edge of the applique piece and the zigzag stitch to jump over into the applique piece. The secret is to guide so you barely see the stitches. Even with me using red thread in my needle, it's very difficult to see the stitches, and that's the effect that you want to get. You just see the applique, not the stitching. The other type of applique stitching is using your satin stitch. The satin stitch is at a zigzag that's very close together. The difference between this and your blind hem stitches, you definitely will see your satin stitches. This gives you an interesting effect and more of a three-dimensional effect to your applique. Once again, you're going to place the fabric under the presser foot and lower your presser foot so the needle is again hitting right in the center between the applique and your base fabric. Begin to sew so that the needle is going halfway onto the applique and halfway out to the fabric. Slowly stitch and pivot. You can see I'm gently moving the fabric and pivoting it as I'm sewing. See the difference? You can really see the stitches on this one. When I hold them up together, you can see the blind hem and the satin stitch. To now construct our pot holders, create fabric loops and attach to the top corners of the apple pieces. Place under the presser foot and straight stitch, back stitching several times. Now take your back fabric and place your front apple fabric face down. Then place a layer of batting on the bottom. So the layers you will have are your batting, your backing, and your front fabric. Pin it in place and then straight stitch. Be sure to leave an opening for turning. Use a 1/4 inch seam allowance and begin to sew. Leave your needle down, raise your presser foot, and pivot when you reach the corner. Once again, at the second corner, lower your needle, raise your presser foot, and pivot the fabric. When you reach the bottom again, back stitch and pull the fabric out. To prevent bulky corners, trim the seam allowance across the bottom. Now turn your pot holder right side out. Take your pot holder to the ironing board and press the seams flat. Also, gently press under your lower edge where you had turned and hand stitch in place. If you'd like to add extra embellishment to your pot holder, you can now straight stitch approximately 1/4 of an inch out to add another dimension. Place the fabric underneath your presser foot and use the foot as a guide to straight stitch around the applique. Lower your needle and pivot when you reach a corner. You've now finished your creative applique pot holders. If your sewing machine has decorative stitches built into it, you may want to experiment and see the beautiful effects you can create. On the Christmas stocking, there are decorative stitches to create a crazy quilt effect. On the placemat and napkin, a feather stitch has been used. I'll continue sewing the feather stitch on the inside of the placemat. Lower the presser foot so it's centered between the two pieces of fabric. Set your machine for a feather stitch, lower your needle, and begin to sew. Take some time and experiment with the decorative stitches in your machine and see the interesting effects you can create. We've discussed a lot of exciting ideas and techniques today for quilting. We talked about applique, using the blind hem stitch as well as the satin stitch. We discussed using templates. We also put a wonderful quilt together. Here are some other helpful hints for displaying and storing your quilts. As I mentioned before, quilts are no longer just for the bed. Today you will find them displayed as works of art on tables, couches, and the walls. To display a quilt on the wall, you will need to distribute the weight evenly using a fabric sleeve like the one we created earlier in this video. This will prevent stress on the fibers of the quilt fabric. If you decide to display the quilt as a tablecloth, you may want to have a piece of glass or plexiglass cut to the size of the tabletop. This will prevent staining. Imagination is your only limitation when displaying your latest quilting projects. Whether draped over a chair, used as an accent on a mantle, or shown on a stand as a beautiful decorator touch, quilts are a welcome addition to any room. Great care should be taken when cleaning your quilt. The frequency of cleaning largely depends upon how your quilt is used. Quilts that are used on beds or sofas should be laundered as infrequently as possible to prevent fabric damage and fading. Quilts displayed as wall hangings are best cleaned by vacuuming or using light shaking to remove any accumulated dust. Vacuuming is a great way to clean quilts. Not only is it a gentle way to keep quilts looking their best, it makes the periods between washing your quilts much longer. When you vacuum a quilt, simply lay it flat on a padded surface and vacuum it gently with an upholstery brush attachment on low power. Again, wash your quilt only when absolutely necessary to avoid undue stress on the fabric. Be sure to hand wash your quilt using the mildest soap available. Thoroughly rinse until all the soap residue is gone. Leftover soap can dull the color of the material. To dry the quilt, lay flat and air dry. Hanging quilts is not recommended due to the water weight pulling and stretching the fabric, seams, and batting. Some quilts can be machine dried, but in general, automatic dryers will cause shrinkage and exert stress on seams and fabric. When storing a quilt, it's best to lay it flat on a bed. Believe it or not, quilts receive more damage from storage than from use. Fading, fabric deterioration, and creasing are some of the ways a quilt can be damaged. To prevent fading and fabric deterioration, keep the quilt out of direct sunlight. Before storing a quilt, consider padding the folds with acid-free tissue paper or unbleached cotton fabric that has been washed and thoroughly dried. This method of storage will help prevent permanent creasing. Also remember not to stack other items on top of a folded quilt. Putting weight and pressure on the folded edge may weaken or break the fibers. Occasionally change the fold lines by refolding the quilt. After the quilt has been carefully folded and wrapped in tissue paper or washed muslin, store it in a clean, dry location. This will prevent staining and mold and mildew. We at Singer Sewing Company hope this video has inspired you to create your own wonderful quilt projects. This video is meant as an introduction to quilting. Many of the techniques shown here can be applied to countless variations of quilting projects. Now that you have learned these basics, expand your horizons by learning more about quilting. Check your local library or bookstore for books about quilting. You may also find local quilt clubs and classes in your area. And as always, the internet has a wealth of information. We hope you have enjoyed quick and easy quilting. Happy quilting from Singer Sewing Company.